The wind on Flat Iron Ridge spoke only one name, and it was the one Elias could no longer bear to hear. Sarah. It was a high, keening whisper that rattled the loose pane in the bedroom window and stirred the dead leaves over the 2 mounds of earth behind the house. For 2 years, that wind had been his only conversation. The silence in his clapboard home, his only reply. He stood on the porch, watching the sun bleed out across the plains. A dull, familiar ache in his chest. Grief was a patient companion. It didn't demand much, just everything. He was turning to go inside, when a flicker of movement by the gate caught his eye. Not a coyote, not a deer. It was a figure, stumbling, lurching through the twilight with a desperate, broken rhythm. He squinted. A woman. She fell, crawled, then rose again, her focus locked on his porch, as if it were the last light in a dying world. She collapsed onto the bottom step, a mess of torn fabric and dark, spreading stains. Her face, pale and streaked with dirt, turned up to his. Her eyes were wide with a terror so profound it stole the air from his lungs. "Please!" she gasped, a sound like tearing silk. "They're coming! Help me!" Elias didn't move. Every instinct, honed by 2 years of solitude and loss, screamed at him to shut the door, to bolt it, to let the world handle its own savage business. Helping was a fool's game. He had tried to help before. He had failed. He looked from her desperate face to the 2 quiet graves in the twilight. The wind whispered its cold reminder, Sarah. But the woman's hand, trembling and bloody, reached for the worn wood of the porch, leaving a dark print. It wasn't a request, it was a prayer. And God, it seemed, had a sick sense of humor. He let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding, the sound a low growl of resignation against the uncaring wind. He carried her inside. She was lighter than a bale of hay, but carried the weight of the whole damn world. He laid her on the thick wool blanket in front of the cold hearth, her breath coming in shallow, ragged bursts. The scent of pine and dust in the room was suddenly cut with the coppery tang of blood. It was a smell he hadn't had in the house for 2 years, and it made his stomach clench. He lit a lantern, the yellow light throwing long, dancing shadows across the room, making it feel both larger and more crowded. Her dress was torn along the side, revealing a deep, ugly gash in her ribs. It wasn't a wound from a fall. It was clean, deliberate. A knife wound. Elias was a rancher, not a doctor. He knew how to stitch up a calf or set a broken fence post, but the delicate work of mending human flesh was a country he hadn't visited since he'd held cool cloths to Sarah's fevered brow, a futile gesture against an enemy he couldn't see. He went to the kitchen, his movements stiff and unfamiliar. He pumped water into a basin, his own reflection a ghostly stranger in the dim light. He found the tin box of medical supplies tucked away in a high cupboard, layered in dust. Inside, the carbolic soap and sterile bandages lay waiting, untouched monuments to a time when this house had been a place of care, not a tomb. He knelt beside her, his large, calloused hands surprisingly gentle as he cleaned the wound. She flinched in her delirium, murmuring words he couldn't catch. As he worked, his gaze fell on a mark just below her collarbone, partially hidden by her dress. It wasn't a scar, it was a brand, a cruel symbol seared into her skin, a symbol of ownership. The sight of it sent a cold dread through him that had nothing to do with the blood on his hands. This wasn't just a woman who had run into trouble. This was a woman who had escaped it. And the kind of men who brand what they believe they own do not give up their property easily. The fire in the hearth remained unlit, but a different kind of cold was seeping out of the floorboards. She woke just after dawn, not with a start, but with a slow, cautious opening of her eyes, as if testing, the reality of her surroundings. She saw him first, sitting in the armchair across the room, a shotgun laid across his lap. Her body went rigid, a cornered animal preparing for the final fight. "Where am I?" Her voice was a dry rasp. "My house," Elias said, his own voice rough from disuse. He didn't move, didn't want to spook her more than she already was. "You're safe, for now." She tried to sit up, a sharp hiss of pain stopping her. Her eyes darted around the room, taking in the sparse furniture, the dust motes dancing in the single shaft of morning light. The door. Always the door. "Who are you?" "Name's Elias. This is my land." He paused. "Who are you?" She just stared at him, her gaze a wall of mistrust. He saw the calculation in her eyes. Was he a savior, or just a different kind of captor? He couldn't blame her. He got up slowly, setting the shotgun against the chair, and went to the kitchen. He returned with a tin cup of water. He didn't hand it to her directly, but set it on the floor within her reach. A peace offering. She watched his every move, her knuckles white where she clutched the blanket. After a long moment, she reached for the cup, her hands shaking so badly that water sloshed over the rim. She drank greedily, her throat working. "Who did this to you?" he asked, his voice low. She shook her head, her eyes dropping to the floor. "Doesn't matter." "It matters to me," he said, the words surprising him as much as they might have surprised her. "They left you for dead. They'll be looking for you. I need to know what I'm up against." She looked up then, and for the first time, he saw something other than fear in her eyes. A flicker of defiance. "You shouldn't have helped me," she whispered. "You should have closed the door." "It's a little late for that," he said, a wry, bitter twist to his mouth. "Door's already open." And they both knew that some doors, once opened, could never be shut again. The first sign came 2 days later. It wasn't a thunder of hooves or a shout in the distance. It was quieter, more sinister. A single rider silhouetted against the eastern ridge at sunrise. The figure just sat there on his horse, a black etching against the pale sky, looking down at the small ranch nestled in the valley. He wasn't admiring the view. He was counting windows. He was measuring distances. Elias saw him from the kitchen window, a mug of coffee halfway to his lips. He froze, the warmth of the mug doing nothing to stop the chill that spread through his veins. The rider was too far away to make out features, but Elias knew the type. He'd seen them before, in towns, men whose stillness was more dangerous than any threat. After a long, unnerving moment, the rider turned his horse and melted back over the ridge. He hadn't come close. He hadn't needed to. The message had been delivered. Elias set his mug down with a clink. He walked to the fireplace and took the rifle down from the hooks above the mantel. A fine layer of dust coated the dark wood and oiled steel. He wiped it away with the heel of his hand. It felt heavy, solid, an old and terrible friend. The woman, she had told him her name was Lena, was watching him from her makeshift bed. "What is it?" she asked, her voice stronger now. "Company," Elias said grimly, breaking open the rifle to check the chamber. It was empty. He went to a locked chest in the corner of the room, retrieved a box of cartridges, and began to methodically feed them into the weapon. The metallic click-clack of the shells echoed in the quiet room. "They know," Lena whispered, pulling the blanket tighter around her. "They know I'm here." "They suspect," Elias corrected her, his voice flat. "It's my job to make them certain it ain't worth finding out." He walked to the west-facing window, the one that looked out toward the long, empty road. He found a hammer and some loose boards in the barn and began nailing them across the frame, each thud of the hammer a declaration. This was no longer just a shelter. It was a fortress. And he was no longer just a grieving man waiting to die. He was a sentry. The tension in the small house was a palpable thing, thick as winter fog. They moved around each other in a silent orbit of necessity and fear. But on the fourth night, something shifted. A storm rolled in. The wind that usually whispered Sarah's name now howling with a fury that rattled the very bones of the house. The rain came down in hard, angry sheets. It was a violence that mirrored their own, and somehow it broke the silence. Elias had made a thin stew from jerky and the last of his potatoes. He ladled it into 2 bowls and set one on the crate beside Lena. For the first time, she met his eyes without flinching. They ate, the only sounds the scrape of spoons against tin and the roar of the storm outside. "He owned a dozen of us," Lena said suddenly, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Silas. He bought girls from back east, the ones nobody would miss." Elias stopped eating, his spoon hovering over his bowl. He didn't look at her, just stared into the fire he'd finally built, its warmth a small defiance against the cold. "He has a big ranch over the mountains. Said we were his family. But you don't brand your family." She traced the spot on her collarbone through her dress. Elias thought of his own family. He saw Sarah, her face bright with laughter as she pulled their son, little Thomas, onto her lap at this very table. He remembered the smell of her stew, rich and warm, the feeling of Thomas's small hand in his. The memory was so sharp, so vivid, it was like a physical blow. He squeezed his eyes shut for a second. The contrast between that warm memory and this cold, grim reality was a chasm. "Why'd you run?" he asked, his voice thick. "He was going to sell me. To some men heading further west." "I heard them talking. They weren't buying a maid." Her voice trembled but didn't break. "I figured I'd rather die in a ditch on my own terms than live in a cage on theirs." Elias looked at her then, truly looked at her. He saw the grit beneath the fear, the steel spine holding her together. He had been living in his own cage, a prison of memory and grief. This girl, with nothing, had chosen to fight for a freedom he had willingly surrendered. "Good choice," he said softly. And in the flickering firelight, for the first time, a fragile, unspoken alliance was forged between 2 broken people in a storm. A week after Lena's arrival, a horse and buggy crested the hill. It wasn't one of the Silent Watchers. It was Sheriff Brody, a man Elias had known since they were boys. Brody was a part of the world Elias had shut out, a world of laws and consequences that felt 1,000,000 miles away. He reined in his horse, his eyes taking in the boarded window with a practiced, weary gaze. "Elias," he called out, not dismounting. "Heard some strange talk in town. Figured I'd come see for myself." Elias stepped out onto the porch, the rifle held loosely in his hand. He didn't raise it, but he didn't set it down either. "Nothing strange out here, Brody. Just the usual." "The usual doesn't include boarding up your windows," Brody said, his eyes sharp. He leaned forward, lowering his voice. "Silas Blackwood lost some property. A girl. He's put the word out, offering a handsome reward. He runs a tight ship, but this one slipped the leash. You know anything about that?" Elias's face was a stone mask. He could feel Lena's presence behind the closed door, a silent, terrified wait. This was the moment, the precipice. He could tell the truth. Brody would take her, and Silas's men would be called off. His life would return to its hollow, silent peace. The graves out back would have his undivided attention once more, or he could lie. He could stand between this girl and the hell she'd escaped and invite it to his own doorstep. What would you do? Protect the quiet grave of your past, or risk everything for a stranger's future? "Haven't seen any girls, Brody," Elias said, his voice as flat and empty as the plains. "Just been me and the wind out here. You know how it is." Brody held his gaze for a long time, searching. He was a good man, but a pragmatic one. He knew what Silas Blackwood was, and he knew the kind of trouble that came with crossing him. "All right, Elias," he said finally, straightening up. "But you be careful. Silas's brand of trouble, it doesn't wash out." He turned his horse and rode away, leaving a cloud of dust and an unspoken warning hanging in the air. Elias turned and went back inside, the lie settling in his gut, heavy and cold as a stone. He had made his choice. The door was not only open, he had just locked it from the inside. The lie changed everything. There was no going back now. The unspoken truce between Elias and Lena solidified into a grim partnership. The enemy was no longer a vague threat on the horizon. It had a name, and it had the law looking the other way. 2 days later, they found the coyote. It was hanging from a fence post near the road, its throat cut, a clear and brutal message. "This is what we do to things that stray. This is what we'll do to you." Elias cut it down with a stony face, but Lena saw the flicker of rage in his eyes. The fear was still there, but now it was mixed with a cold, simmering anger. The quiet rancher was gone. In his place was a man preparing for war. They worked together, their movements falling into a shared rhythm. He showed her how to load the old shotgun, her small hands fumbling at first, then growing steady and sure. She tore strips of cloth for bandages, boiled water, and organized their meager supplies with a quiet efficiency. She learned the layout of the ranch, the sightlines from each window, the blind spots behind the barn. In the long, tense hours, the silence between them began to fill with words. Not many, but enough. He told her about the ranch, how it had belonged to his father. He spoke of the drought one year, the blizzard the next. He talked about cattle and horses, the simple, tangible things of his life before. And one evening, as they sat cleaning the weapons by lantern light, he finally told her about Sarah. "She loved this place," he said, his voice low, his hands working a patch over the rifle's stock. "Said the sky out here was big enough to hold all your dreams." He paused, his hands stilling. "She got sick, a fever. The doctor was a day's ride away. By the time I got back..." He didn't finish. He didn't have to. Lena listened, her expression unreadable in the dim light. She didn't offer empty platitudes or pity. She simply nodded, a shared understanding of loss passing between them. He had given her a piece of his pain to hold, and in doing so, it felt infinitesimally lighter. He was still a man haunted by ghosts, but for the first time, he wasn't facing them alone. The attack came as the last light of day bled from the sky, painting the clouds in shades of bruised purple and angry orange. It started not with a bang, but with the tinkle of breaking glass from the back of the house, a rock hurled from the darkness. It was a signal. Elias didn't hesitate. "Get down!" he yelled, grabbing the rifle. Lena was already on the floor, dragging the box of shells toward the fireplace as he'd shown her. The first gunshot exploded the quiet, a deafening crack that splintered the doorframe. Elias fired back, not aiming to kill, but to pin them down, to show that this house would bite back. He moved with a lethal grace he hadn't known he still possessed, a predator defending his den. The years of grief fell away, replaced by pure, focused instinct. He was no longer the broken man who mourned by a grave. He was the man who had built this ranch, the man who had fought nature and won, the man who would not be moved. Another shot shattered the last unbroken pane in the living room window. Splinters of glass rained down near Lena. She didn't scream. Her face was pale, her eyes wide, but her hands were steady as she pushed a fresh shell into the shotgun and slid it across the floor to him. He glanced at her, a quick, sharp nod of acknowledgement. In that moment, they were not a man and a woman, not a rancher and a fugitive. They were a single unit, a desperate, two-person army against the darkness. The shadows outside moved, testing the perimeter. A man darted from the cover of the barn, trying to get to the porch. Elias's rifle barked once. The man cried out and fell back, clutching his leg. The air was thick with the smell of gunpowder and fear. It was a chaotic, brutal symphony of survival, played out in the heart of a place that had only known silence for far too long. The house groaned under the assault, but like its owner, it refused to break. The siege lasted less than an hour, but it felt like a lifetime. After the cry from the wounded man, the firing from outside grew sporadic, then stopped altogether. There was the sound of a horse galloping away in panic, then another, and then silence. A profound, ringing silence that was deeper and more absolute than any that had come before. Elias waited, rifle still pressed to his shoulder, his body humming with adrenaline. He scanned the darkness, every nerve on fire. Nothing. They were gone. For now. He slowly lowered the rifle, the weight of it suddenly immense. The room was a disaster zone. Broken glass glittered on the floorboards like deadly frost. The air was hazy with smoke. A dark stain was spreading on the wall where a bullet had passed through. He looked at Lena. She was still huddled by the hearth, the shotgun held tight in her arms. She was trembling, but her eyes were clear. She had not broken. He walked to the window and peered out. In the faint moonlight, he could see them, the two mounds of earth near the cottonwood tree. Undisturbed, sacred. Lena came to stand beside him, her gaze following his. She finally saw what he looked at every single day. "You lost them," she said, her voice impossibly soft. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact, of understanding. Elias's composure, the hard shell he had worn for 2 years, finally cracked. A tremor went through him, a deep, shuddering fault line of grief. "My boy," he choked out, the words tearing from his throat. Thomas. He was only 6. The confession hung in the ruined room. Sarah. Then him. The fever took them both inside a week. I was away, on a cattle drive. I wasn't here. The guilt he had carried in silence for years poured out of him, a raw, toxic flood. I wasn't here. He didn't weep with loud, heaving sobs, but with the silent, soul-crushing tears of a man utterly defeated by his own memory. He braced his hand against the wall, his head bowed. He waited for judgment, for pity, for the recoil of a stranger. Instead, he felt a small, steady hand on his forearm. Lena just stood there, her simple, quiet touch of balm on a wound he thought could never be reached. It wasn't forgiveness. It was something more powerful. It was witness. The sun rose on a world scrubbed clean by violence. The light spilled across the damaged ranch, illuminating the splintered wood and shattered glass not as ruin, but as evidence of a battle survived. Elias had dragged the wounded attacker, a young man barely out of his teens, now silent and dead from blood loss, out to the barn. The reality of what had happened, of what he had done, settled in the morning quiet. The threat from Silas Blackwood wasn't over. A dead man would bring more trouble, not less. But something fundamental had shifted inside him. He was no longer just waiting for the end. Lena was cleaning the main room, sweeping the glass into a careful pile. There was a purpose in her movements, a claim being staked on this space. This was her home now, too, a place she had fought for. Later, Elias found himself standing before the two graves. The wind was gentle today, a soft sigh through the cottonwood leaves. For 2 years, this spot had been a place of endings, a testament to all he had lost. It was the anchor that held him to his grief. He heard a faint footstep behind him and knew it was Lena. She didn't approach the graves, but stood a respectful distance away, giving him his space while simultaneously refusing to let him be alone in it. He looked at the hand-carved wooden markers. Sarah, Thomas. The names no longer felt like an accusation. They felt like a memory. A sad, beautiful memory of a life he had lived. He turned his gaze from the graves to the vast, open horizon. The plains stretched out, endless and uncertain. The road leading away from the ranch was empty. For how long, he didn't know. But for the first time in 2 years, he looked out at that emptiness, not with despair, but with a grim and unfamiliar resolve. The silence was broken. The house was awake. And though his heart was a patchwork of scars, old and new, it was beating again. He was a broken man on a broken ranch, but he was no longer alone. And in the quiet promise of a new day, that felt like everything.